So Behavior just released some actually huge news regarding the next patch, as well as clearing the confusion regarding the surrender options in the game. So let's talk about it because this is some juicy stuff. So first of all, Behavior is not going forwards with the haste and hindered stacking removal from the PTB into life. So this means indeed that all haste builds are still alive. Now the devs did intentionally say that they won't be moving forward with all of the changes, which means some of them are staying. I believe that the number that appears on the right will still be there, which is a huge quality of life change. However, what I am really unsure of is the buffs to the haste perks that will be there. They said that the perks we saw in the PTB will continue to go live, except for Champion of Light, which will receive changes, which I am assuming is going to be a prevention of Fixated from stacking with it. However, that means Dark Theory is keeping the buff, which can be stacked with Made for This and Hope. And most importantly, Unbound will keep its buff. And if this is the case, this is a huge buff to all haste stacking builds, as the perk alone already felt incredible in the PTB. Furtive Chase will also be buffed if I am not mistaken, but the buff is what the perk should have been in the first place. So overall, I am very happy with them keeping haste and hindered stacking builds, and now that Unbound was buffed, this also brings a new variety of builds from the PTB, which are now going to be even more insane. Funny how a patch that was going to kill so many builds will now be one of the patches to add so much build variety thanks to the buffed Unbound. If this is the way forward, no changes are needed to any haste perks as of now, and every suggestion from my haste related video can be ignored, as they were all made with haste not stacking in mind. But I did see potential in this mechanic, only if it was done right. Who knows if they will bring this mechanic back in the future, but this time with significantly more changes to accommodate for it. And now something more spicy that the devs shared with us is the conditions regarding surrender options and if they count as wins or losses. It turns out that the killer never wins in any situation when there is a surrender option involved. According to the developers, if all survivors are bots and the killer abandons the match, this will be considered a draw, not a win, when by all accounts it should count as a win since the survivors just gave up and left the game. Now if you care about winning, you have to play against bots and finish the match instead of just abandoning it when the last two survivors decide to abandon themselves. I would like to know why they decided to make this a draw rather than a win. The only theory I have in mind is to prevent MMR from being boosted accidentally for killers. Think of it like this. Imagine you are a Skull Merchant player which everyone hates. A lot of survivors decide to DC against you the moment the match started. So now, you abandon and this counts as a win for you. However, you didn't play the match and you didn't improve as a player. So even if you won, you didn't play. So your next match will have higher MMR. And once you do play against survivors who are not crybabies and understand that Skull Merchant sucks, you get absolutely demolished since your MMR has been artificially boosted by DCing survivors. This is the only situation I can think of that defends the devs' points, but as a counter argument, I can say that even now, if I want to, I can just kill the bots instead of abandoning and increase my MMR either way. So even then, it's such a reach and so rare that I don't think taking this into account is important. Now, the other situation is if the match has continued for 10 minutes and no generators have been completed or regressed, then the game actually considers this as a loss for the killer. A lot of content creators like Oddsdarva and Hens have showed the abandon mechanic in play, as they thought that this was a way to win a match by a different, more mean and toxic way, but it turns out that the game considered this as a win because of a bug. However, the problem of counting this as a loss is that this means your MMR as a killer will be reduced, which leads to the potential of basically reverse boosting your account in order to go play against weaker survivors with absolutely zero penalty. Besides, this is the only surrender option that can be technically forced by survivors stealthing for 10 minutes, so I once again do not understand why this is not considered a draw at least, if you as a killer technically won the match. This being counted as a loss is a massive issue, as now some players that are very good might force weaker killers on 10-minute chases, which if you know what you're doing, this is entirely possible against babies, and now those killers will get to lose, going down in MMR. However, for the survivor side, since the killer has abandoned, that means they can just keep playing on the same MMR doing 10-minute chases against inexperienced killers. As for the killer side, if you get this option with busted killers, since the game counts it as a loss, that means your MMR will be less, which in theory should put you with worse survivors, making this tactic easier. So in other words, you get to play the game and demolish survivors for 10 boring minutes, and you end up keeping all of your blood points as well as losing MMR, giving you worse survivors in the next match. This mechanic is a huge problem in my opinion that incentivizes horrible gameplay for both sides, and this is funny considering this was added in order to prevent that. In my opinion, the game should consider this as a win. If the killer was able to hold generators for 10 minutes, that means they either tryharded in an extreme way, or that means survivors didn't do their objective for 10 minutes. It was, regardless, a win for the killer in 99% of the situations. That way, if the killer keeps doing this boring tactic, their MMR will increase, giving them harder survivors in the future, up to the point where this tactic won't work again. As for the survivor side smurfing or reverse boosting, this is already possible just by going next on hook. The thing I am very curious about is the regression part, which is in this post, and as far as I am aware, was not stated before. If this is something new, that means this surrender option will only work for survivors that are stealthing in the match, and not for killers, which prevent survivors from doing gens. Making it regression based fixes this playstyle, but it's weird still how this is counted as a loss for killers. If the killer is not able to kill and the survivors are not able to do their objective, the game should be a draw at least, not a loss for the killer. But if you think this was bad, just check out the survivor conditions. If a survivor leaves because their teammates are all bots, this counts as a draw. Now I get why the devs did this, even if I technically disagree with this. If your teammates decided to leave, it's unfair to lose a match because of it. As a survivor, losing MMR is even worse, as that means you will get worse teammates, which is a death sentence in solo queue, so making this a draw is understandable. The problem is with the second option. If all survivors are slugged on the ground and they abandon, this is not counted as a loss. Instead, this is counted as a draw. This is super weird, because as a survivor you are incentivized to always abandon when all survivors are slugged, because if you don't and you stay in the match and get sacrificed, this will count as a loss. It's completely flawed currently and makes no sense either. Let me be the devil's advocate here and try to understand why behavior thought this was a good idea. In my opinion, it's simple. The devs do not want to reward the killer from slugging everyone for the 4K, and that is why they decided to go this route. Losing to a slugging killer means that you only get a draw as a survivor, but the crazy thing here is that if you as a killer decide to abandon once all slug survivors abandon the match and thus became bots, this means you get a draw too. So an absolute win for the killer turns into a draw for both sides in some cases. The problem with this is that slugging is a viable tactic that can naturally happen in the endgame, for example as a twins. So now as a killer, you get punished technically, and survivors, because they played poorly in the endgame, don't get to lose, and instead they get a draw. This just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. However, this creates a very weird situation with the draw condition. Now survivors can come to the killer as a survive with friends in order to get slugged intentionally just so they can abandon the match, keep their blood points, and not get a DC penalty. Since this information is now public, this means until the devs add the go next prevention mechanic, you can go with your friends to a killer you don't want to play against, like a Kaneki, have them slug you all, and just leave with 0 penalties. Another problem with this is when 2 survivors are left in the match. If you get downed and the killer decides to slug for the 4k and finds your other teammate, you can just abandon the match and it won't count as a loss, as instead it will be the same as if you found the hatch. Since you abandon and you become a bot, the person who just got downed could also abandon and get a draw. This means 2 of the 4 survivors in a lost match actually didn't lose according to the game, which leads to a very weird scenario when these survivors have died for sure. This means as a survivor, it's technically easier to win MMR now than ever before in the history of the game. Now let's imagine that disconnecting when everyone is logged is counted as a loss for survivors, but disconnecting when everyone is a bot doesn't. This also creates a weird situation where the last person disconnecting will never lose the match, because since everyone else that was logged disconnected, this means the last person did not abandon because of the slugging situation, but because their teammates are bots. So unless we know that behavior has a system to put slugging abandons as priority, this means being the last person to abandon will always be the best outcome to not lose your matches. Since the devs are asking for feedback regarding this mechanic, this is how I would handle these situations. If no generators were done in 10 consecutive minutes, the game should count this as a win for the killer in order to put them against better survivors that have more odds at beating this boring playstyle. If a survivor abandons the match because all of their teammates are bots, the game should count this as a draw. And here is the new condition. If all survivors are slugged in the match, the game will now take slugging abandon as a priority, and any survivors abandoning in this situation will count this match as a loss. If the last survivor abandons after everyone else did and became bots, since this abandon is still because of the slugging one, this also means the last person will get a loss too. And now, if the killer has slugged all 4 survivors and they all abandoned, the killer can choose to also abandon and get a win, skipping the hooking and finishing Mori part if they want, but not allowing them to slug in low MMR in order to keep getting wins and not boosting their MMR. However, if survivors become bots before you slug them all, say they abandoned super early in the match, or they got demolished against a pig in the first chase and they decide to DC, then you can abandon the match and this will count as a draw, since you basically didn't get to play a real Dead by Daylight match, and thus the game should not make calculations of your skill. That way, there is a clear difference between getting a draw because you don't want to play against bots and getting a draw because survivors lost against your slugging. Whether or not you like this, slugging all 4 survivors should be a loss for survivors and a win for killers. It makes no sense that you can reverse boost right now by playing a lot of killer and intentionally losing in your matches and then get baby survivors, slug all of them for the 4k, wait for them to abandon so they keep their MMR, get blood points, and get to keep your low MMR after abandoning since all survivors are bots, allowing you to abuse those survivors back again. This system is understandably very complicated but flawed, so I hope they add some changes fast. Truth be told, I don't care about winning or losing in this game. The thing I care about is killers and survivors abusing these abandon mechanics in order to reverse boost in the game, which is a problem in every single game this is possible. Let me know what you think about this, as this is a very complicated discussion. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.